Well, they think that if you slip these stones on, then you can't get back.
Just give me a second to spread these all out by person. All right, guys, what we're going to do is questions directed at each of you individually, and then I do have one that is an all-speaker question. So we're going to start with that one, and we're going to do our best to keep our answers short so that we can get through as much as we can. Our goal is going to be to get through the all-speaker question and at least one question directed at each speaker. Some of them are very similar, the questions, so they're about 3 or 4 dinosaur questions, so we're going to throw that to Dr. Marcus Ross. So just, we're going to, as we get going here, so just keep our answers short. Here's the first question. What resource would you recommend, other than the Bible, smiley face, to support a biblical view of science, paleontology, archaeology, etc. for children, specifically for children? And this was for all speakers, so if someone want to jump on first there, I will. I wouldn't recommend any. I would defer that to people who know what
That was cheesy.
Well, Marcus, you do a little bit of this. You're in this field, and so why don't you? This is a great opportunity for you to pump some of your stuff.
Camera's off. Well, when it comes to teaching science like paleontology or dinosaur issues and things like that, honestly, there are very few resources that I recommend, and partly because as a paleontologist, some of those dinosaur books, especially ones that are looking at science and faith types of issues, are honestly not very good. And so I'd rather not use something than use something that I think, or not use something that I think is really bad, than plug it. Now, I mean, I do a bit of children education through the company my wife and I started, for Cornerstone Educational Supply. We write lesson plans and things like that. But most of that is targeted for little at-home science experiments if people are doing homeschool projects or things like that. But I think the best thing that you can do when you're teaching your kids science is remind them that they are experiencing the wonder of the created world. And I think that was brought up really well earlier today, that we have this amazing privilege to read the world that God made, in addition to read the word that He had written. And if you can keep plugging in your kid this idea that they are exploring a world that has lots of things that are known, but even more things that are not known. Science is so often just like, learn this, this is Newton's law, this is Newton's other law, this is his third law. Like, did Newton do anything besides write laws? Yeah, he did. Is there anything left to do? Yes. Yes, there's lots. Go out, grab a hammer, hit a rock, find stuff. That's my big advice. Go ahead, grab a hammer, hit a rock, find some things. Make a collection. Right.
All right. Anyone else?
You said say something. So, no, I like Marcus's answer. I would divide this science category for children into 2 compartments. One would be things to deal with dinosaurs and so forth, and I would say I see a lot of interesting looking books at a major homeschool conference in Southern Ontario, but I don't know which ones would be the good ones and which ones wouldn't. I would definitely defer to Marcus on that. The other aspect, the other science stuff, would be teaching your children to practice the scientific method and explore God's creation, which is exactly what he said. It got me excited as a boy, like rock collections, butterfly collections, do your little electrolysis of water, electroplate a few things, all simple kitchen stuff, just don't blow up the house when you produce the hydrogen from but get them excited in these sorts of things and teach them the scientific method and what that is, good science. Now, there is inference to the best explanation, and that's the next phase, which, well, Logan was talking about, you were talking about. That's all I'll say about that.
I will say one thing about a dinosaur book that I know is on its way, written by creation geologist Paul Garner. He also has a master's degree focusing on paleontology. He's from the UK, and I know he's got a dinosaur book that is coming, and he does great work. He wrote a fantastic book called The New Creationism a few years ago. This dinosaur project has been ongoing, and I expect it to be here available in the States and in Canada probably this year, or maybe the very beginning of next. So Paul Garner has a book on dinosaurs. I know it's coming. I've seen a few pages of it already, but I'm not sure when. But that is going to be good. That's going to be a really good book.
Logan, you got anything?
No, I mean, I think in general in apologetics, sadly, there aren't enough resources for children. And I think that that's a need in the field. And so I even would say, I love that point that John was making about how parents really often are the ones who understand the questions their kids are asking, and often can be the best ones to give an answer that they know will be meaningful for their child. And so I would say, that's the sort of thing I really, not being a parent myself, I sort of defer to those who are parents. I think for a young child, I imagine you want to feel, when they ask a question, Noah's Ark, or dinosaurs on the Ark, what are you going to say? I think it's helpful as a parent for you to think about, whatever, when it comes to these kind of questions, I need to feel that my child can ask questions, that questions are welcome, and I want to affirm that, and that's a good question. And, depending on how old the child is and when the question's asked, I want to, along the lines that John helps to explain, I want to form this child to have a faith that's deep, that's thoughtful, but as well is one that's eventually, as they get older, nuanced. And I think that as a parent, we can even have that attitude of humility in the way we speak to our children to foster that. In the meantime, if you are a parent and you've thought about these issues, consider maybe writing something helpful, and maybe run it by Marcus or others, and really think about, here's something I found helpful. I think there's a need for it out there.
If I could add just one more point on this, just thinking in terms of paleontology, geology, right? There's a lot of concern about age of Earth issues within the church, and what if I give my kid this dinosaur book, and what are they going to do? I told you I was thinking about this stuff when I was 9 and had to process it. Don't be afraid to grab a book that's at the library, and even if it talks about an age system that you agree or disagree with, there's much wisdom and much good stuff that's in there. And you get an opportunity then to talk to your kid about those questions and to deal with them one-on-one. And that way they didn't do, I'm an introvert, so I was alone in my room, but some other kids like to externally process a little bit. They want to ask mom, they want to ask dad. I've got a couple kids like that. I got another one who's just like me, and I got to go find him in somewhere. What are you thinking about, right? But don't be afraid. Don't be afraid of what others have discovered and described, even if their interpretation is different from yours. Because T-Rex is T-Rex, no matter when it lived. It was there. It was big. It was terrible and fun, right? And all that. And those are the data, right? Never be afraid of the data, and be willing to grapple with different interpretations. And that will be a great way to show your kid those critical thinking skills that we're all thinking, how do we help build these? Start young and start with questions and start being able to say, I don't know, let's go find out. That was, in the movie that I was in is Genesis History. The director made that movie because he was watching the Ken Ham Bill 9 debate that happened in 2014, and his daughter had some great questions. His daughter was 11, and he said, I don't know the answer to that. And he started trying to find some of the answers, and he's like, what, I think there's a whole bunch of other people have got questions about this, and maybe we should do a video of some kind. And then that became a full-fledged movie that was released in over 700 theaters in 2017, and then re-released in 2018 to even more. And so you never know what a question from a kid is going to do. Who knows? But it can do some amazing things for the world of God.
And there are lots of good resources that may not be kids' resources, but that when the kids ask, is that such and such, you can find a good resource. We were doing devotions one night after church, after supper. We were reading the story of Paul's shipwreck, and it talks about the anchors being dropped off. And one of my sons said, "Have they ever found those anchors, Dad?" I said, "Well, that's a good question. Let's go online and find out." So BibleArchaeology.org, plug there, and we, sure enough, there's an article on ship's anchors from Paul's shipwreck, and what it did was, I believe, it wasn't a kid's resource, but we're able to talk about it now, and we're able to see that this is a true story, that there is evidence for it, and like to John's point of including that interdisciplinary aspect to our Bible study is a good thing even for kids. So that's good. Okay, here we go. I'm gonna go right down the line. This is how we're gonna do this. So Logan, question for you: how did all the apostles' letters sent all over the world come together to become our scriptures?
Yeah, that's a great question. The theological word that's used to describe this is the canon, the New Testament canon. How did that get put together? And that word actually just, originally means the measure, sort of like a measuring stick. And I think that's helpful for us thinking about how that canon got put together. Because often, the narrative that, you might read on the internet, which isn't well researched, is that, well, see, there was this Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, and that's where Constantine was present and decided what would go in the New Testament. So because of that, your Bible is just what Constantine wanted. That's often the view that's out there. It's an up from the top to the bottom view of how the New Testament got imposed. But actually, this idea of canon and a measuring stick really reflects the real reality of how the New Testament got put together. There's a fragment of papyrus called the Muratorian Fragment. It dates to about 180 AD, and that is the earliest list we have of books in the New Testament. We see that it wasn't complete. There are, I believe it was around 18 or so at that point that people had realized, we think this is authoritative scripture, but how did they even come up with that? A measuring. They used a measuring stick, if you will. They looked at questions like, can this be traced to the testimony of an apostle? Is it widely accepted, this book of the New Testament, this possible book? Is it accepted just in one corner of one region of the Christian world, or is it accepted more widely? Does it fit with the Old Testament? Is there a sense of canonicity across the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament? And further, does this seem to cohere with the other scriptures we are more confident about? So I was just speaking with a friend about the Gospel of Thomas. And one interesting part of that gospel, which isn't in the New Testament, is that at one point Jesus was trying to persuade Mary that she would need to pray to become a man. It's because that's a higher spiritual status. And we look at that and we say, that just doesn't seem to fit with the Jesus I know. So gradually, over time, there was this recognition, using this sort of measuring stick, which books fit this criteria. And I believe actually, so Council of Nicaea had nothing to do with the canon of the New Testament. That was all about whether Jesus was fully God and fully man. That was resolved there. But I'll just end with this, that the canon was finalized at the Synod of Hippo. I believe that's like 387 AD. But gradually you'll see the list got more and more completed. But what I just think is fascinating, as I was trying to make the case in my talk, is that even still today, after 2,000 years of study of the New Testament scriptures and other documents on Jesus, the most skeptical scholars like Barton will affirm what made it in the New Testament, those are the earliest sources. There are a few debates with, Revelation at the end, that was quite late, or even the Gospel of John is pretty late, but when it comes to the ones that are often proposed as replacements, they are even much further later, and they don't seem to fit. And so I think all this does is just gives us confidence that what made it into the text wasn't just an emperor who pushed down his agenda, really it was a recognition of an authority that God protected within his word. So I think that's something I find helpful.
Low battery here.
Just grab that other microphone behind John.
It's a little too close for my liking. All right, Marcus, a number of them, I'm going to read all of them, because, well, not all of them, but all of the dinosaur ones. So here it is, because they relate with dinosaurs and humans, which obviously is in odds to the conventional paradigm of science, of current accepted science. So here it is. What's your view on when dinosaurs roamed the earth? Were the dinosaurs living in the same geographical area and time as people? And were there dinosaurs at the same time as humans? Were they separated geographically? Did they never interacted? And kind of related to that, what does the Bible say, if anything, about dinosaurs?
All right. It's a very common question. It's a good question. And this gets into your treatment of the days of Genesis 1 and your ideas of whether the genealogies are giving you a more or less complete history going back to Adam. My perspective on this is that the days of Genesis are indeed 24-hour periods of time. I don't see a linguistic way in Hebrew getting around that very well. And that the genealogies are intending to show us this continuity between Adam all the way to faithful Abram. And we're given the ages of the patriarchs and how old they are when the next person in this lineage comes about, precisely so that we can back calculate, at least roughly, about the age of the time of Adam. And we can, thinking of some of the talks that I've mentioned here, this testimony of history, and how the church has viewed this. You can see members of the church doing this all the way back to the patristic period. You can see Jewish studies looking at establishing the age of the earth and their traditions as well. So this isn't something that's new, like, Bishop James Ussher came up with this concept and said the earth was 4004 BC, and he was the first one to do this. This is a long-standing tradition. Even people like Augustine and Origen are recognizing a young earth for that. So if the earth is young, and then when are dinosaurs created? Dinosaurs would have been created primarily on day 6 as the beasts of the field. That's a Hebrew term for basically wild animals. Some of them were probably also created on day 5 and as flying creatures. The Hebrew word there is kind of generic for it flies, so your pterodactyls, pterosaurs sort of stuff, and the great sea monsters. Quite a few qualify for sea monster, and I studied mosasaurs, very monstrous. Very happy they're dead. Otherwise, going to the beach would make the movie Jaws look like Finding Nemo. I mean, it's just... So if these creatures are created, the plesiosaurs, the dinosaurs, the pterosaurs, if they're created on day 5 and day 6, and we have a young Earth, then yes, they are contemporaneous with humans. They don't need to be geographically in the same locations, and from what we see in the rock record, if my interpretation of the rock record is reflective of Noah's flood is correct, then we have no evidence of human beings and dinosaurs in the same rocks anywhere in the world. And we don't seem to have much of a record of dinosaurs living in what I think is the post-flood period. So I think dinosaurs were brought on the ark, but I don't think that they survived long afterwards. The ark is a chance at survival, but not a guarantee. And so when I look at that, I think, all right, most of the dinosaur record that we have reflects the destruction of their ecosystems, the destruction of the places where they were living, and that these seem to be different from our modern ecosystems today. We have a much more heavily mammal-dominated ecosystem with us at the top. In the pre-flood world, it seems like there were a lot more and diverse ecosystems, which should not be surprising that the world that God initially created was very good, and he told the animals to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. But it does seem that those ecosystems were probably much more highly segregated in space than we see some of our ecosystems today. But I look at the flood as a destruction, sequential destruction of ecosystems as the floodwaters invade further and further into the continents of the world. And human beings, being a tad more clever than others, are able to escape later into the flood, but ultimately they don't make it either. And so yeah, we believe that the dinosaurs were made alongside man. Now, as to the question, are they mentioned in the Bible? That's harder to say. A lot of people will point to the two creatures in Job of Behemoth and Leviathan. We have to understand that those words are, like behemoth is the Hebrew word behemoth. We don't know what it is, so we use the same word to describe what it is. In fact, it's the plural word because it's such a majestic animal. And how you interpret the anatomy of behemoth is going to lead you to or against maybe a dinosaur. So if the tail sways like a cedar tree, is talking, if we got the anatomy correct on that, and that's the tail, there's only one set of animals that really fit the bill, and that is dinosaurs. Dinosaurs held their tails out rigidly, they were very large, and every time they stepped, the muscles that were at the tail attached to the legs. So every time the back leg moved, the tail would sway back and forth, back and forth. And so when I'm looking at that description, I say, okay, this is one of the better instances I have in the ancient world that seems to attest to the anatomy of something like a dinosaur. Leviathan is too generic for me to identify. It lives in the water, it's scaly and really angry, and that's about all I got. I don't know that it's a dinosaur versus a really huge crocodile, of which we have some in the fossil record. You got 50-foot long crocodiles. Yeah, praise God, all dead. So I'm cautious. I'm very, very cautious about asserting that dinosaurs survived into the medieval period and that Legends of Dragons are really dinosaurs. Maybe, but here's where I actually do agree with Carl Sagan, which I don't do very frequently, and that is that tremendous claims require tremendous evidence to back them up. And so we want to get close to those eyewitness testimonies. Did people see them? God is saying to Job, "Behold the behemoth, which I made alongside you." So this is a creation week creature. We're well after creation week, but the implication here is this is a day 6 creation. It eats grass, it's gigantic. And we'll ponder this and ponder the greatness of God. But after that, I don't see anywhere in the Bible where we might have a candidate for a dinosaur.
It's interesting too that Job, most scholars would say, is the earliest, potentially one of the earliest books written. That's well getting closer back to the actual event.
Yeah, so we're close to the time of Abraham for that. Some of the people that are mentioned in Job seem to match up with the early chapters of Genesis dealing with Abraham. So we're not that far from the flood. And so there's a potential for there still being some residual dinosaurs around, but there's probably not that many.
All right, Gary. Question for you. Have people uncovered any archaeological evidence for Noah's Ark?
You've seen it on the internet, you know it's true, it's up there. I have a number of my colleagues in the archaeological world who are still working on the mountain we call Mount Ararat. Now, the Bible says Noah's Ark landed on Mount Ararat, true or false? It was a question I was hoping you could answer.
False.
False. It says it landed on the mountains of Ararat. That's the Hebrew term. Urartu was the Assyrian term, and Urartu was a kingdom that we know where it was, and it was in the area of what we call Ararat today. Urartu and Ararat, an ancient kingdom. The area that we understand today as Mount Ararat, that's true, but it wasn't a single mountain. It was on the mountains of this region that we know as Ararat or Urartu. So you don't know which mountain, but the famous one that we have all the stories, most of the stories about, in fact, even Josephus doesn't say Mount Ararat, a particular mountain, but he goes into a list of 4 or 5 ancient writers. He said it's up there, you go see it. In fact, so-and-so said it, so-and-so said it, so-and-so said it. So we have this kind of historical evidence for a mountain in that region. I have a number of, over the last 2 decades, colleagues, people of faith, good people who are doing some decent scientific thinking are up there. As far as I know, I don't know they were there this year, but they were last year and the year before, probably were there again this summer, on top of Mount Ararat in the snow looking. I will tell you this for sure, whatever you've read on the internet, there's nobody alive today that we know of who can give you the latitude and longitude of where Noah's Ark is located. We are not at all certain that it's on that mountain, and if it is, where on that mountain, and if it's not on that mountain, is there another mountain, or is it gone now? Now, there have been historical, there have been the eyewitness accounts, at least supposed eyewitness accounts in the 20th century. We've just never been able to verify any of those. There's no question in my mind it happened, and I think it was in that part of the world, Ararat, Urartu, but which mountain and is there any still left, we just don't know. I will say Henry Morris's son John, who Henry Morris, they were very excited and worked really hard to try to find it a couple decades ago. John finally said that we spent some time together, and he said, look, I'm not so sure that God wants us to find it. It just doesn't look like we're getting anywhere and this may be something he chooses for us not to know. Or maybe he'll reveal it at a certain time, but I think it's up to God, not to our best thinking, because we've tried everything we know to use, and so far, nobody knows if it's up there anywhere at all. Latitude, longitude, we don't know.
And even, I should mention, within the AVR community, a couple of the guys who have written for AVR hold differing views as to the mountain. I know Rick Lancer and Gordon France have gone back and forth in scholarly debate in a healthy way. So even within our organization, we have those differing of opinions. So yeah, Kirk, I'm going to give you two, because the first one I think is a really easy, short answer, and that was, in the video in the TED Talk of micro machines, was that real footage?
No, that fellow giving the talk is the fellow that it's computer generated graphics, and he's the one that did that. So that's his work, and if you want to find out more, Google TED Talk molecular machines.
And I think that comes from Harvard, doesn't it? From one of the Harvard Medical, was an initiative there.
It's been a while since I looked at it. It's actually a part of a longer thing.
So here's the question. I knew that was a short one. So in justifying macroevolution, how do evolutionary scientists explain the increase in genetic information in the DNA needed to make it happen, i.e., the increase in the number of gene pairs in going from one-cell organisms to human beings?
Yeah, okay, that's a good question that would actually take more than 1 minute to answer, but in general, it's thought that often in reproduction, sometimes maybe an extra duplicate gene, this is just one example of how they would say it, a duplicate gene is accidentally reproduced, and since it's not needed over here, it's kind of like back home, if you had an extra guy show up for work and we don't need him over here, we can use him over there. So that duplicate gene now is free to get messed up, mutated, sequences changed, and then at some point there's a fortuitous function that it can somehow perform, and it's a handy function, and therefore natural selection says, hey, well, it doesn't really say that, but natural selection, it gives it a greater advantage over the other normal organism, and so that one is preserved, and then you got a new gene here that produces a new kind of protein, and this goes on and on. The problem is that when you actually look at these genes, it's a needle in the haystack problem. The actual kind of genes that will produce a protein, these proteins have to have a particular three-dimensional structure, and those stable structures are exceedingly rare. So most of the sequences you would produce will not produce a stable 3D structure. And as a result, it's like trying to break into a bank vault by randomly figuring out trying different combinations, but you never remember ones you've already tried. And you could work for a long time if you have a bank vault that has 3 different numbers and there's 100 different options for each number. This is even worse. You have an average of 300 different sites, a combination that has 300 options, and each option has 20 options. And almost none of those will work. By I say almost none, I would say roughly, if you said 10% would work, that'd be 0.1. If only 1 out of 100 worked, that'd be 0.01. Well, in this case, you're looking at probably something closer to decimal point with maybe 150 zeros after it, and then you have your 1. So there's not enough time in the universe, it appears, and I'm really doing a lot of work in this area right now, there's not enough time in the universe, the last star will burn out, run out of fuel before you could actually accidentally hit a combination, and biology doesn't decide these. Biology doesn't decide them at all. Physics does. So biology has to search around blindly, as Dawkins would say, and mindlessly, it's got no objective, to try and find these golden combinations that were theirs from the foundation of the world determined by physics, and accidentally cobble together something at the same time, on the same planet. So the theory is that it's a random thing. It's just a fortuitous event, and that's how it happens. It's wild. Like, if you actually test this, it doesn't work.
Hey, John. Because culture is so powerful and molding, how can we know if we have created a good balance if we can't even tell we are being shaped by it?
It's a really good question, so thank you for whoever asked it. It depends on what you mean by no. And if you mean by certain, how can we really make this clear distinction between this is culture and this is, what I think the Bible really teaches? Hard to know that for sure. I don't think that we ever can really know and step outside of our culture and confirm that what we're thinking and what the Bible teaches are matching up with 100% accuracy. But what I do think that we need to do, and so maybe let me just set the question aside, I would say we just need to do the best that we can, even if we can't discern what's our inherent belief and where we've been molded by culture. We need just to go back to the text and say, what do I think that it's teaching? If I'm looking at it as honestly as I can, and I'm really trying to understand what it says, without imposing what I want it to say on the text itself, and then try and live in accordance and with that and hold to that perspective, even though I'm not sure how much culture shapes me, I'm going to try and do my best to be faithful to the text in an honest way.
Thank you. We'll go down the line again. We'll see if we can get through everybody with another question. And then I have one final question I'm going to tell you right now, just so you can be thinking about it when you're not on the hot seat, and that's this. What is one book that you have read recently in your particular field of interest, or one book that you would recommend to people who are interested in your particular field of interest? So just a one resource thing, so just give that some thought.
A recipe for disaster.
All right, there we go. It's good. Okay, Logan, this one says, have you listened to or read any of David Percott's writing? I understand he uses the writings of early Christian theologians to, as he puts it, correctly interpret scriptures. Can you speak to this and explain the dangers?
I just have to say I haven't read David Percott, but maybe I can comment on using church fathers as we interpret the scripture. I think this is a great question. It even gets back to the question of culture. How do we read the Bible? What's the best way to do that? I think in our culture today, there's the extreme of saying everything is interpretation. We can't know what it really says because your interpretation is as good as mine, and who can really know? And I think this sounds quite compelling in our culture today as we engage this issue. Of course, it falls in on itself when we realize, someone could say to me, I really disagree with your faith, and I'm an atheist, and I think the Bible's all wrong. And I might say, oh, I'm so glad that you're also a follower of Jesus, and you respect his word as an inerrant and infallible. And they went, no, I didn't say that. I could say, well, that's how I interpret what you're saying. But that would be ridiculous, right? Not helpful for that conversation. But it's at least to show, when it comes to interpretation, the reality is, yes, there's something about language. When you and I have a conversation, there might be some things I miss. But to say that everything is interpretation, well, that would mean we couldn't talk at all. But we can. We can, with words, communicate what I'm meaning to say and what you're meaning to say. And it might be there's some points around the edges that are a little unclear, but the central part of our, what we're talking about, we can talk about. So when it comes to the Bible, I think that we need to first be really looking hard at what does the text say for itself. I think we need to do this, focusing on what, thinking about, let's say you're in the Gospel of John, and I think good preaching should do this. What's the book of John all about? That's one of the books that actually is the most clear. John tells us at the end, I have written all these things so that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, and that you may have life in his name. So that means every part of John's book, I need to read through that lens. Here's a reason John's given me to believe that Jesus is the Christ and to have life in his name. So I would say, when it comes to the text itself, our priority should be, as much as we use commentaries and church fathers and that sort of thing, I think we should really try to let Scripture speak well for itself, except the places where it's unclear, but also to let it speak with what is clear, which I think there is the vast majority in the heart of our faith. When it comes to the church fathers, I'd just say, just be aware that some of them, take Origen. Origen was officially, labeled a heretic by the church. Like officially named, church was more centralized back then. So I would just say, when you're picking up Origen, maybe be a little careful. Just be aware that these authors, which are helpful to read, we still want to put under the authority of God's word and take that seriously. So I would say, go ahead. It helps you get into scripture more deeply, wonderful. But I would say, let's not treat what some of these church fathers say above the text itself, or let that make us lazy with the hard work of getting into the meat of what is God really saying here in this part of his word.
Thank you. Marcus, why are there no human fossils from the flood era?
I don't know. This is a question I get a lot because it's a very obvious one, right? I just said before that there are no instances that I know of in geology where dinosaur and human fossils are found in the same rocks. There are no, at least I don't know of any legitimate human artifacts that have been recovered from dinosaur-bearing rock layers or deeper. There have been claims of that sort of thing. You'll read those in some older creationist books, and they live on and live long on the internet, despite some of our best efforts. But there aren't any. So, as I mentioned, I think that this is probably tied to our ecologies and ecosystems in the pre-flood world. But it is a vexing problem, and I can't pretend that I've got a good answer for that. I wish I had a better one. What I do see is that in what rocks that virtually all young Earth creationists think are post-flood, and that would be the stuff from the Ice Age and a little bit lower. I tend to think that the flood, and if you got that little time scale, I think that most of the age of mammals that we see in our dinosaur books and paleo books is actually a post-flood recolonization period. Some creationists put the level of the post-flood world a little bit higher in that yellow, but most of them have it at least somewhere in the yellow. I put it right down at the bottom of the yellow. It's my own particular interpretation. What we do see, though, amongst all young Earth creationists is that the human record is post-flood. And this is where we're going to have to talk later on, about how we understand human diversity, what species are part and parcel of the human family, and how this relates to the account of the Tower of Babel. This is an area that requires a lot of work within creationism. There's been some good work, especially done by my colleague Todd Wood, about trying to identify who is and who isn't human in the fossil record. It's a bigger family than you'd thought. But they're all descendants of Adam, they're all descendants of Noah. They don't all look exactly like we do, which is intriguing, very intriguing. But we see evidences of humanity in things like the Neanderthals and Homo erectus in a lot of ways, and that's going to lead us to ask a very interesting question: is that what did Adam look like? What did Noah look like? Did they look like us, or did they look weirder, or did we look weirder? I think that's probably the case. And Adam might have looked at us and like, why is your head so big? Your brain is gigantic. What happened to you? And you start thinking like, wait a minute, no, I just insulted the entire room, right? And myself. But when we look at the fossil record, we have a tendency to interpret Adam and Noah. I mean, the Sistine Chapel, we know what Adam looks like. He's a white guy, kind of Italian. And God's an older Italian gentleman, right? Open any Zonderkids, open any other book, as we were mentioning earlier about the Garden of Eden. I thought that was a great point. I think you had said, which one of you guys said, has your view of Adam changed? I think it was yours. Has your view of Adam and Eve and the account in there changed, like your ideas in math have changed? And they need to. They need to. You're absolutely right. The text there is so rich, but on the paleoanthropological side of things, we also might have to re-envision the way that we think of Adam and Eve, because we have a tendency to put ourselves back in time. Right? Charlton Heston was Moses. Greatest story ever told had a Jesus who was 6'4" and Swedish. Jesus was so average looking that Judas had to kiss the boring Jewish male that was Jesus, so the Romans knew who to get. So we have a tendency to look back in time and see ourselves. What we need to do is look back in time through the rocks and see the data for what it is. And right now, I'm still looking for those human fossils deeper in the flood, but I don't know. I need some colleagues. Who wants to join?
Marcus, I would just like to say that by saying that God is an older Italian man, you have endeared yourself to half of Sault Ste. Marie.
Large Italian population here.
Praise the Lord. That's why the rolls for our sandwiches were so dang good. I know. I grew up in the Italian Northeast, so I was very happy.
Okay, Gary, in archaeology, is carbon dating reliable?
Of course, you're familiar with, most of you I sure I assume are, very familiar with the some of the controversy and issues with it. We use it, archaeologists above all else use pottery to date things. I mentioned earlier cars, people just know cars. Some people just really know cars. Archaeologists become experts in pottery. And a lot of times a piece of pottery is not found in a particular layer. It's something that's been jumbled up. And you look at that vessel and you just know what it is and the basic time period, 100 years, couple hundred years, when it was popular, when it would have been made and used. So we get really familiar with pottery, and that is the #1 thing we use. Of course, inscriptions would be the best. And not only what it says, this is such and such, but even the script itself, you can date the script within a couple 100 years or so, because they wrote this sort of letter based on all the other inscriptions we find. So we use, that would be best, and we don't usually have that. So first off, we use the scripts, but then most of the time we use pottery. And then carbon dating, and now there's other radiometric dating besides carbon that is used. And we have problems, the farther back it goes, we feel like there are more and more difficulties. So we do use it. We recognize it has some value, but it is one of the tools that we use to date things. But archaeologists, universally, pottery is the key, and then we use other things, including dendrochronology, tree ring dating, anything else we can use. But pottery is still #1, and particularly people with a non-evolutionary viewpoint don't appreciate carbon dating. We feel like there's difficulties with it, especially the farther back we go.
And if you want to do some reading on this, there are some articles on ABR's website that talk particularly about pre-2000 BC, 1500, 2000 BC. A lot of the dating is off scenes by 150, 200 years, particularly in the Levant region. So there's some more reading you can do. I encourage you to do that on that particular one. Okay, Kirk, how can we know when something is good science or scientism when we see an article or something like that come across? For most of us, I think maybe it's in the media where we see it. Is there a way we can be discerning in that if we don't have the training?
I would say one key would be, and this is really where I think the heart of discerning what good science is. The first thing I would recommend is trying to figure out what good science is. What is the scientific method? And this is something as parents you should acquaint yourself with. It's not hard at all. Just Google scientific method and then start teaching that to your children. Once you discern what good science is, and then inference to the best explanation would be the next step, as I said. So first step is to know what good science is and what a good inference is. The second step would be to read the article critically. And you might look for lack of data words or wishful thinking words, like I highlighted today, like perhaps, could have been, many people believe, those kinds of words. And another thing to ask is, how do I know? You see, the same type of skeptical questions that are being directed at Christians and the Bible and their faith, there's a structure and a theme to those questions that also need to be directed to everything else, including these articles you'll read in the media. So how do I know this is actually true? What experiment was done and what were the results? Is there anything I can point to? Or is this just speculation or conjecture? Often you will see in the secular media words like, this might be the case. I mean, I remember, and this is a little off the science thing, but it's just a classic example, Globe and Mail a number of years ago. Full-page article on how the Dead Sea Scrolls might cause us to have to rethink the Bible or something like this. Oh, I was interested, so I read column number 1, column number 2. I'm on the last column, about 2/3 of the way down. It says, they haven't actually found anything yet, but it might be this way. But the headline clearly led me to believe this. So is there some content, is there substance in the article that can actually support the attention-grabbing headline? So train yourself in critical thinking, critical analysis. What do I see in here to actually, and if it's nothing, if it's vague, it's hand-waving, then you really got to start being skeptical of that article, of their conclusions. And a lot of articles are like that.
Thank you. Okay, John, is deconversion a largely North American phenomenon or a worldwide phenomenon?
I think it's largely North American. I think it's largely a result of sort of an Enlightenment, modernity kind of understanding of what the criterion for truth is. And so I think, yes, it would be much more Western, much more European, North American. Yeah, so not just North American, but definitely European. I mean, so you can sort of see how Europe is about 50 years ahead of Canada when it comes to social issues and religious issues. And Canada is probably like 25 years ahead of the United States. So if I want to know where the United States will be in 20 years, I just have to look at where Europe is now. And if you want to know where Canada will be in 25 years, just look where Europe is now. And yet in South America, in Latin America, in Africa, in those kinds of countries, and in China, Christianity is flourishing, really. I mean, the trend is to see people in Western countries as losing their faith, but in these other countries, the trend is actually in the opposite direction. Pentecostal versions of Christianity really are exploding across Latin America, and the numbers of people in China who identify as Christians are probably more than the number of people who are in the Communist Party. So in those cases, Christianity seems to be growing worldwide, and in North America and in Western European, these sort of secular modern cultures, it's shrinking.
That's good, thank you. Okay, guys, last question. One resource you would recommend as maybe a must-read in the area that you're kind of passionate about in this field that you'd recommend to someone in the church?
Sure, there's actually a book that hasn't come out yet, but is about to come out, called Can We Trust the Gospels? And it's by Peter Williams, who's based out of Tyndale House in Cambridge. He's got a great familiarity with Malcolm, who I really do think is one of the leading voices on this issue, but who is also quite academic. And so I think Peter Williams has written a really good, accessible book. I think it's published by Crossway. I think it'll be coming out later this year, so I recommend that.
I would highly recommend for anybody who's interested in science, especially, The Quest is the name of the book, by Todd Wood. Todd Wood heads up Core Academy in Dayton, Tennessee. He used to teach at Bryan College, which Dayton, Tennessee is the home of the famous Scopes trial in the United States, which dealt with evolution issues. So Todd Wood's book, The Quest, is a slim read. It's about 140 pages. Not small font either, it's pretty nice, and every chapter deals with a hard question in Christianity and science and creation issues. And every other, in between those chapters, I really love this feature of it, is what he has called an adoremus, which comes from the Latin, come let us worship. And each one of these is a small little vignette, almost a little devotional about some way in which the natural world points to the Creator. And so you have hard questions, a recognition that we don't have all the answers, an invitation to faith and an understanding of what it's like to walk for a distance. This is a quest. It's not just I'm going from point A to point B. I might not even know where the end of this is. So highly, highly recommend the Quest. We've got it at cornerstoneedspa.com. Todd's got it with a donation to Core Academy. It's not published by a standard publisher just yet, but I'm pushing it because it's an outstanding book. He just finished writing it this summer. So it's a great one.
People ask me all the time that what's the best single book I can get on recent archaeology, and I can't think of a particular book by a particular person that is current, that is really covering all the things that people generally are interested in. 2000, let's guess it's been about over a decade ago, Zondervan published the Archaeological Study Bible. It's out of print now, but they've got lots of copies out there, and you can get one pretty cheap. At the time, it was just about the best thing. The study notes and special breakout sections, little short articles, 300, 400, 500 words, really did deal well with topics that we would be interested in, and even the study notes at the bottom were very good. Well, that book got over 10 years old. They just came out with a new one, and I use it in my historical geography class at the seminary I teach, and it's the Cultural Background Study Bible by Zondervan. And it costs the whole Bible, and it just does a really nice job of dealing with cultural background issues, events, people, and of course just the general study notes are good, but these breakout articles are really well done. The ESV, English Standard Version, just came out with its own archaeological study Bible. I'm mad at them because I think they did a really bad job with the Exodus and the Conquest. They didn't even give a conservative date, which the date that we use at Associates for Biblical Research. And so they didn't even discuss it, an article by evangelicals for evangelicals, and they just left off what I think is the biblical date. So we fussed at them. Now they're coming back around, and of course can't change that, but they want us to do some other things to help, fix that up a little bit. But that's not a bad study Bible, but I think they really missed it on that part. So you want something with good current archaeological stuff across the board. I would suggest those above any other single book because it covers so much, done by good scholars, good conservative scholars, not perfect, but good. And it'll be good for the next close to 10 years, really giving you a good basis of what's the most recent stuff from a conservative perspective, reasonably conservative perspective, on the culture, cultural backgrounds, and biblical archaeology.
In the era I spoke of today, now first of all, I'm glad to hear the book that you recommend. I'm not familiar with it. The name Todd Woods rings a bell, but I'm for general science. I'd like to check that book out. With regard to what I would recommend, part of the problem for me is finding a book that's current and that covers, a broad range of things. And I just found that to be a little bit discouraging, especially with the sheer number of scientists who would identify as Christians who are going into theistic evolution. There is an excellent big book that just came out this past year on theistic evolution, about yay thick. And numerous authors looking at all different sides of it. I'd recommend that if you're interested in seeing when I say on theistic evolution, I mean responding to it, arguing against it sort of thing. But in general, one of the reasons I started my blog that I referenced this morning was to try and fill the gap on individual questions that people have, the kinds of questions I'm running into. So I would refer you to my blog. It was up there this morning. It was, what was it, p2c.sh/contemplations, and it's searchable by topic. There's a whole series in there, about a 4 or 5 part series on should I put my faith in science, which was part of a big chunk of what I talked this morning. Anything I say that might be controversial is referenced, and I try and keep that current. For example, on the problem in experimental science and peer-reviewed journals. I'm constantly adding. It's probably becoming one of the best bibliographies in the world because I get a lot of sources. They're feeding me with info, and that goes in there, and so it's growing by every second week or so. Another one gets added to the mix. And I've been asked by my supervisor, we'd like you to do a 10-part series on God and science. So I'll be starting to put together the outline, but that'll gain beyond that blog post. I call it a blog, but I don't talk about what I'm having for breakfast and have pictures of my food. It's meant to be a long-term reference for Christians, atheists, the whole range.
Well, I joked earlier that my book was the one book I could think of, and to be honest, it's the only book I can think of, and the reason why is because I wrote it because there were no other books out there like that. There are lots of books by people who have lost their faith, and I can direct you to those if you want, and then you can read those and see where they're coming from. But as far as people who have been writing on the topic of wrestling through why people lose their faith, that's the only one that I'm aware of. And I would like to say, and I say this for your sakes, not really so much mine, the books that I get, that I've been selling, I get a 50% discount from the publisher. When it goes up on Amazon, probably at the end of next month, it will be 50% more expensive. They're selling it for $34 on Amazon, but you can buy it through my website for, I think it's $22 US. So if it is something that you're interested in and you're going to be like, oh, I'll get it from Amazon, go to the website, you'll save yourself like $10 or like 70 in Canadian or something.
Well, that's good. Well, on behalf of all of us, I just want to thank you guys for agreeing to come. And it's been, I have just been blessed to have heard from you and to learn from you. And so I want to thank them. Can we give them a big thank you? Well, this brings to an end the first ever Ready Answers Apologetics Conference. Thank you to all who wrote in questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to cover all of them, but we'll continue to consider if we run something like this again. I really hope we do, and we'll keep you posted on that. ReadyAnswers.ca is where you can find all of the talks. Give me a little bit of time to get that up online, and then that'll be there, and then we'll be letting you know through Facebook and through Instagram when those talks are up and online. And maybe what I'll do is Len Peak out there? Len, get up here. We need Len to come. He doesn't want, he hates this, but we're going to get him up here too because I think we need to say thank you to him. He lended so much behind the scenes as my liaison here at Bethel, and so I do think we need to say a thank you to Len, so come on up here. You know what, just for one shameless plug, I'm going to get someone in the front row here who knows how to take a picture, just to take a picture of our whole group. Who wants to take a picture? Come on up, there we go. We'll just get the guys together here. And then what we'll do is we're going to head out and we'll be milling around in there for a little bit. You can ask us some questions. And thanks for coming, we really appreciate it.